So we're living longer, period. But the proportion of the population is also changing in the US and across the world in many countries. So these three graphs show the proportion of ages in our population. So it doesn't show how the number of people in the country have changed, it just shows the proportion of that. The furthest to the left is from 1971, the middle is 2011, and the far right is 2030 predictions. The bottom graph goes from the age 0, the top is to about 100. The blue bars demonstrate the baby boomer generation. So you all have been special since the day you were born as a cohort, as a generation. And when you were little, there were new schools developed to accommodate this enormous new boom in the population. Libraries were built, schools were built. The whole world was focused around kids and subdivisions and neighborhoods. That's when the suburbs were invented to accommodate the baby boomers when they were little. As they got older, the most prosperous times in the US were when you all were in the prime of your working years, in the 80s and the 90s. You were at the peak for most folks and doing really productive things. And so we saw a boom in the economy. Well, in 2011 was when the first baby boomer turned 65. And so this next chart shows what it will be like when the last baby boomer will be 65 and older. And you can see there, especially in 2030 compared to 1971, that there are older people in our society, and if you look back to 1970, there weren't. So there's always been our society has always been really affected by what the baby boomers have been doing, and aging is one of those things. So independent of the living longer element and the more older adults proportionately in the population element, older adults are still a greater risk for diseases, right? And those can maybe sometimes be attributed to sitting. Older adults spend more time sitting than during waking hours. So when we're talking about sedentary and sitting and all that, it's always during waking hours. So we're working with a 16-hour per day kind of math equation. So always think about it like that. Older adults are sitting more than any other age group. And it's probably because you're not working anymore, most folks, or you're working less, and so what you do is just different every day. And there used to be this old adage really of like kind of giving old bones a rest. And so that was kind of a perception that the day you retired, you got to sit in your recliner and call it a day, call it a life, right? The more research that's being done over these years shows that you all don't want to do that, because that's something else that baby boomers have been monumental in affecting, is the perception of aging. And we also know more and more that it's really not good for you at all to sit that much. And it's boring. It's boring. You're all out. You're not sitting at home. So older adults have a higher risk for type 2 diabetes and heart disease, and sitting might be one of those variables that increase that risk. So we're going to finally get to the sitting part here. Thank you for going through a long history lesson and journey with me. So this is a little bit of that perfect storm for what might be a really big problem moving forward. More urban than rural communities, which we talked about. More sedentary occupations, which we've talked about. Less physically active leisure time. I love television. I love it. I will not really talk too badly about it as an organization or an industry. Less communicable diseases, more chronic diseases, means we have longer lifetimes. There's the larger proportion of the population as the baby boomers are aging into those later years. And then older adults sit more than other age groups. So right now, all of you at this exact moment in history are probably at the highest risk for these diseases from sitting and being sedentary than probably any other generation or age group that's ever lived. But again, we can't totally blame TV. especially when we're in the golden age of been better than ever. Enjoy a TV show or a movie just like anybody else. And I thought, when I first started doing this research, I thought, well, surely any kind of sitting is equally bad. Doesn't matter if you're reading the paper, reading a book, or watching TV. But turns out there is something a little extra specially bad about watching TV. Can anyone take a guess at what that might be?
Well, you're not doing too much thinking.
You're not doing thinking. That's true.
Eating more.
Eating. We just have other bad habits that are easier when we're watching TV. If you're reading, your hands might be kind of occupied, right? So it's harder to keep going into the chip bag. So there is something a little extra dangerous about watching TV, and it has nothing to do with the 24-hour news cycle. It might have to do with the other habits that come along with it. So before we talk more, and I say the word sedentary 2,000 times in the next chunk of time that we're spending together here, let's define what it is so that we're all on the same page about what this means. So it is waking behavior characterized by an energy expenditure of less than 1.5 multiples of the basal metabolic rate while in a sitting or reclining. Whew. A lot of clinical and research terms, but broken down, it means you're probably either sitting or reclining, you're awake, and you're not moving much. And I chose this graphic too because I also want to really break down some of the stereotypes that sedentary has to do with lazy and fat. I think that's an unfair stereotype. There are plenty of people that are overweight and extremely active, and plenty of thin people who are very sedentary. So I went the other extreme and just picked a skeleton. I don't know. So what does less than 1.5 metabolic basal rate, or whatever that MET stands for, what does that really mean? So here's a research study that I took out of, I took the chart out of to give you a sense of what not moving much and what being sedentary means. So sitting, TV, reading, whatever, that's 1.33 METs for an average person. So that is less than that 1.5. Typing in a seated position, even though you're moving your hands and your wrists a little bit, still below that threshold and considered sedentary. And then the other things here are all not considered sedentary. And we can go through the range of that. So they have playing Wii. Now Wii isn't that popular anymore, but it was, 5-10 years ago, and I think it was to really show that not all video games were sedentary, but it was that one game where like you could bowl, and it was like you were simulating bowling. And they thought this was like a perfect panacea for sedentary behavior. Well, it kind of came and went. But even standing still, so you can look at that, like you think like, okay, you're not moving. My heart rate isn't increased. I'm not engaging too many muscles. It's still a higher MET than sitting, even than sitting and typing. So I think right there is an important thing to notice, that all by itself, standing is less sedentary, or not considered sedentary even. And then I have walking here at a couple different speeds. So even like, it's hard to walk slowly enough to be 0.2 miles an hour if you've ever like used a treadmill. But if you're injured or have a disability, then that might be a pace. And that's still kind of a lot more than that sedentary number. And then just at 1.6 miles per hour, which for an average person without disabilities is still pretty slow, is over double the definition of being sedentary. So a lot of data that was looked at from a global perspective shows that high-income countries, such as the US of course, spend a majority of waking hours being sedentary. Probably not too surprising to many people. And that these sedentary behaviors are, from a research perspective, like documented research, associated with a lot of time spent watching TV. And for those who sit for more than 1 hour increments with a total of 7 or more hours in a day, they have a 5% increased risk of dying from those diseases, even if they exercise. So that harkens back to that original statement that showed that it was an independent, like exercise and sedentary behavior are really independent variables. There's sometimes not a correlation of those two. But the good news is that there's a dose response to that. And that, again, kind of just as a back to, from a clinical perspective, showing that there's a continuum of health, disadvantage or advantage. It's not binary, it's not black and white, it's not yes and no. There's a dose response. But one study said this in a really interesting way that stuck with me, said that when people engage in 150 minutes of activity per week, which is like the CDC's recommendations, right, for people, that what they do the other 6,500 minutes a week still matters for their overall health. And this chart was pulled out of a research study, but it just shows that it doesn't, it's not black and white. There is this gradient in the middle here. So the left column shows someone sitting less than 4 hours a day. To the extreme on the right, it's greater than 11 hours a day. And you can see at the bottom bit that I bolded that the percentage of death in the population goes up. So it's not just like from here, boop, boop, over there. It goes up a little bit in an angle, although it's more dramatic between the last two sections. So between the 8 to 11 hours, the death rate, or the percent of death, not a rate, the percent is 2.74. But if you go to that extreme amount of sitting, over 11 hours of waking hours, it goes up to 4.53. So sitting too long does create some organ damage. So we talked a little bit already about heart disease, and I'm not going to totally read this for you because you'll have the handout here to take home with you and can read more about these individual disease states. And I know it's small up here, but essentially most of the organ damage that happens from sitting too long is because your blood isn't flowing as fast, and it doesn't have to work against more gravity than when you're standing. So when you're standing, your heart has to pump hard enough to get all the way down to your feet, all the way up to your brain, and it doesn't have to work as hard when you're sitting. So that's really the underlying factor of why sitting too much can cause some organ damage. And then there's something else that happens though with the pancreas. So sitting too long can have an insulin response that puts you at a greater risk for diabetes. That's separate and independent from the heart disease factor, right? And from the sitting. And then they also say that they don't really know why colon cancer is linked to sitting too much, but research shows that it is. So it's probably not too much of a surprise either that sitting too much can make us a little foggy and feel like a little understimulated in the mental area, and that it also can affect our neck and our back and our shoulders. We all know that when we sit too much, think of a road trip even, you get out and you're like, ugh, like man, I hate feeling that cramped and that forward leaning. And we always are fighting this, right? Because our bodies naturally want to go more inward than upward and backward. And so any exercise class that you'll go to, should focus on that good posture and fighting this tendency for us to go in like this. And certainly it can lead to some back problems. Again, if you kind of use it or lose it, right? So if you're not using your body and being flexible and increasing that mobility, then it may be harder to do so when you want to. And of course, it affects all the other parts of you too. If you're sitting like this and you're not really engaging your core here as far as muscles go, so you might just lose some muscle in your core, as opposed to, again, like having a good posture, sitting and standing, and that twisting like you were talking about, and just getting up and moving. And you might have some pooling or varicose veins in your legs. And even always sitting cross-legged too can help, can stop a little bit of blood flow. And so there's a example on the bottom of that handout too that shows what good posture in a seated position looks like, which we're all guilty of not doing all the time at least. But having your feet down, each of them on the floor, helps just make sure that your blood flow can be continuous. Now this research study is when we got really down into numbers and like how many hours is too much and what kind of activity do I need to do. And there's a handout, the other one has this chart on it, and when I blew it up, it's a little fuzzy, so there's nothing the matter with your eyes. It just didn't blow up nicely, probably because it's copyrighted, by the study that published it, that I had access to, but maybe not to great copies of, sorry. So there's two sides to this. There's one that's called sitting time analysis, and the flip side is TV watching analysis. And this is something that you're welcome to do along here with me or take it home and do it yourself. But I want to know where you are today if you're interested in helping reducing the amount of time that you do these other things. If I have made a case here today, most of you probably are already doing more than the average person, which is the paradox of health classes. People who don't need it are not here. So the sitting time analysis is broken up into 4 quartiles along the bottom, and I think I have a laser here. So these are the different quartiles of how much exercise you get during the week. And there's a little calculation note on the bottom of that page where you can fill in what that means. I have a chart here. I'll go ahead and we'll just do this and we'll go back. But so moderate intensity has to do with those METs, right? So if you're at a moderate intensity level, you can probably look up and find what the heart rate is in that range. But here are some examples of what moderate intensity means for people. So be walking, and if you've used a treadmill, between 3 and 4.5 miles per hour. 4.5 miles per hour feels like a light jog to me, but if you've got longer legs, maybe it's still just a very brisk walk. Biking, using a stationary bike, weight training, using other exercise machines, a swimming aerobics class, whatever, that's probably a moderate intensity. And so you can make this calculation for yourself by considering, how many hours a week that you do a moderate intensity exercise. And I picked the number 5 here because the range is between 3 and 6. So if you're walking at 3 miles an hour, you might be closer to 3. If you're walking at 4.5, you might be closer to 6. And then you can multiply that by 7 days a week. And so to get to that 35 MET hours per week that we show on this chart is this quartile. That's a lot of exercising. That's the point. That's 1 hour every single day of the week, or a total of 7 hours a week at that moderate intensity level. So that's kind of a lot. So that's what these quartiles represent. Now within each quartile are the same 4 different stratifications of how many hours a day you sit. So always on the one furthest to the left is less than 4 hours a day. The second one in each of these quartiles is 4 to 6. The next one is 6 to 8, and then the other one is over 8. Okay, just helping you kind of figure out how to read this chart. It took me a minute. On this y-axis is the hazard ratio, and that's just a statistical term to show how much risk you have to no risk. So this line here is a risk of 1, which means no risk. It's kind of the baseline. And so then all you need to see is the relative risk from baseline across for all of these. So if you're someone who goes to the gym 3 days a week for an hour, so that's 3 hours times 5 for that MET for moderate activity, that's 15. 3 times 5, 15. So this one is 16 mets. So let's just say you're at 16 to put you in here, okay? And you watch 5 hours of TV on average a day. That puts you right here. So you see here, that would be your dot, and you go over there, and you're relatively 1.2 at 1.2 relative risk to no risk. So if you are here on this chart, you can see that you're kind of in the middle, from no risk up to the top, which of course wouldn't be a surprise that it's almost moving hardly at all and watching a lot or sitting a lot to put you up way up here at the risk. So again, I don't want anyone to get too hung up on that number per se, but it's just to give you a gauge of where you are relative to relative risk of doing nothing and sitting all day long, which is up here, and exercising like an insane person and not sitting at all the way down here. So just to see where you are on that scale and maybe where you'd like to be. And then the next one is similar on the other side, but specifically TV viewing. And so the calculations are the same to figure out where you are on this graph, and how you read the graph is the same. But at a quick glance, you can see that there is one major difference here, that it goes up broop, 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 right? Instead of more seamlessly. So that means that there is something to say that if you watch more than 5 hours of TV in a day, you're putting yourself at more risk than cutting it back just a couple hours. And that other thing might, and that difference, that jump might be that extra. Some about that in there.
More risk for heart attack, stroke, and cancer.
All those nasty things that none of us want. Yes, exactly. And so back to that question, can those dangers be undone? Let's go back to this chart, because you can see here that, yeah, look at that. Those three categories right there, that's pretty close to being undone, right? So, but that's just sitting time. For TV viewing time, if you exercise like crazy, you can watch about 4 hours or less of TV a day before jumping to this category. So remember, this is still that category of someone who exercises 7 hours a week doing that moderate activity. And if they watch more than 5 hours of TV, look at that. They jump up to that 1.2 already. Now it goes back down again. So even if you exercise less than that other crazy intense person, you watch like virtually no TV a day, your risk goes down here. But there's not too much that's below this line. So the short answer here is yes, if you're willing to work out like an insane person. But for most of us normal people, working out 7 hours a week is a lot. It's a lot to ask. So we already went over this, like that was what that moderate level or moderate intensity means. So this was another calculation that you have on your sheet there to take home with you to figure out where you are today. So I hope I've maybe made the case that being sedentary is a problem. It's a problem for a lot of Americans. It's a problem for adults. It's a problem for the globe. Almost a third of the entire population around the world doesn't get enough exercise. And it has caused, being sedentary has caused maybe as many as 5 million deaths annually, and leads to 4.2% like directly of American deaths. So, and there is a clinical component here that the negative health effects from sitting too long have to do with cardiometabolic and inflammatory biomarkers. However, those little breaks that you were talking about, independent of sedentary time, have positive health effects. So, getting up and doing your little moving, whatever it is, does help. So those breaks are having a positive effect on waist circumference, which really is a proxy to fat. So you generally lose a little bit more weight. And a C-reactive protein and fast-acting glucose. So things that affect inflammation, which can affect pain, of course, and things that affect diabetes. So wow, that seems pretty easy. One thing though that didn't seem to have a connection in this research study was blood pressure and sedentary time. So in all of the studies that I looked at, there were many interventions targeted to people who work in office settings. And again, that's where the biggest people are together, hanging out in a seated position for the most part. So that's probably why a lot of these interventions have been studied and looked at in office settings. So there isn't a whole lot for what a retired person or someone who doesn't work full-time can do to combat sitting, except for a couple that we'll talk about. But just in case you're interested too, it was kind of cool to look at some of those treadmill desks and like standing desks, that there are actually positive health outcomes associated with those. But they're not so much of like, wow, that made a person fit, but it definitely decreased their amount of sedentary time. And that's, again, that's common sense, but we need research sometimes for things that are common sense. So it may not help someone necessarily like lose 20 pounds and become, get a six-pack of abs, but decreasing the sedentary time, as we've seen, has positive health benefits. But taking breaks helps too. So if you do sit and you get up to go to the copier machine at work or the bathroom or whatever, that is contributing to positive benefits. So how do we apply this to our lives? We'll keep talking about that here as we're wrapping up. So I wanted to put this slide in there too to show, this was a really cool study, and it showed the biomarker differences from a seated position just to a standing position compared to a seated position to a stepping position. So think chair to a standing desk or chair to a treadmill desk. So again, it wasn't like a high intensity walk, but from a stepping position. And you can see here that there was a significant effect in stepping that you didn't see in standing on weight. So BMI, the body mass index, and waist circumference, that you could get some effects on stepping and not standing. Again, that makes common sense, right? You're actually moving a little bit. You expect to see a little difference. But both have an effect. I don't know why fasting glucose had an effect on standing but not stepping. That was one element that made no sense to me. And sometimes that's why there was like always conduct more research, because of nuances like that don't make sense. But all in all, there was a significant effect in both standing and stepping in cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, triglycerides, and the glucose amount 2 hours after a meal. So if you've ever been tested for diabetes, there's 2 ways to do it, and that 2 hours after a meal is one way. So that showed a significant effect in the good direction. So you didn't have to do a lot of movement, but just standing helped. And as again, most of it's about blood flow. So just being active, but changing postures seems to have a positive health benefit. Moving from seated to standing seems to be the secret sauce for this. Your hydrostatic pressure changes, and by using more gravity as you're standing, makes your leg and lower muscles work a little bit harder, and it positively impacts blood pressure, heart rate, and vascular tone immediately when you move from a sit to stand.